Welcome to the Futures Forum Live online, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. On this edition of the Futures Forum Live, we exchange ideas, information, education, and inspiration about the future of Black America. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get Futures Sense now. Share this story and share our future. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Futures Forum Live, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. February is Black History Month, and this year we've decided to have a conversation on the future of Black America. Yes, in fact, the future history of Black America. Specifically, I wanted to examine what life might be like for people of African descent in the year 2030 and beyond. And so I decided to begin this series of conversations with someone who has steeped his life and his life purpose in helping to think about the future of Black America. He is Mr. YUL Anderson, a futurist and a graduate of Dartmouth College, a doctoral candidate in research methods in public administration, who actually holds a master's from the University of Massachusetts in future studies. Yes, there is such a thing as future studies for those of you who don't know. He holds certificates also in multicultural studies and Cuban studies and consults with many membership organizations and think tanks in the USA and Africa about the future and about public administration. But more importantly, for our purposes, he is the president and founder of the African American Future Society. I think that's a good place to start our week-long series. And without further ado, please welcome with me my guest for today, Mr. YUL Anderson. YUL, how are you?
Great. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to talk to you tonight.
Yes. So where do we start? I would love to hear more about, first of all, the African American Future Society. Why did you start it and what's the purpose?
So I started the organization after reading the Futurist magazine and being introduced to R. Buckminster Fuller's readings and his work, reading the Limits to Growth, and also knowing about the World Future Society and knowing a little bit about the RAND Corporation. So as a result of the United Nations 50th anniversary back in 1995, I founded the African American Future Society after attending one of the World Future Society conferences, realizing that there were no Black people in the space of future studies talking about the future of the planet. And so I felt it was important for me to gather the insights and the ideas and opinions of people of color to talk about the future and to introduce them to the discipline of future studies.
Well, here we are. It's the year 2018, and the United Nations and the how much 170 odd countries in the world have agreed that the year 2030 should serve as a marker for our onward march to human dignity, human security, and have come up with Agenda 2030, which has 17 goals called the Sustainable Development Goals with 169 targets. So you know what the picture is. 8-point-something billion people, AI ubiquitous everywhere, Internet of Things, unemployment high, etc., etc., etc. As you think about Agenda 2030, and specifically Agenda SDG 10, which talks about inequality, I'd like for you to tell me, how do you, as somebody who is also a public policy person, right, see this issue emerging in America, and specifically, how does the future of inequality look to you?
Thank you very much. So I also do work on the internet communications technology, as well as artificial intelligence and e-government, having been a government administrator for over 30 years, working for various governments here in America. And one of the things I notice in relationship to e-government is that there is a push to try to lower the inequality measurement to try to make it more equal. But as we know, many people don't have bandwidth, they don't have access to the internet, they don't have the means to pay for the internet. And so the internet has become a divider as much as it is a convener and a gatherer of people and ideas. What we're finding in this space of artificial intelligence, ICT, and e-government is that people are being left behind. The elderly, of course, are not able to adapt to the new technology. The people of low income are not able to pay for the technology. And so we're seeing a widening gap of the haves and have-nots, definitely impacting the future of low income people, where a lot of African Americans sit and find themselves. And we see a greater divide in the developing countries of Africa in particular, whereby in which bandwidth and accessibility seems to be of great concern.
Yeah, but as I think about that, let's look at America versus Africa. It might be true that, you know, not everybody in Africa has bandwidth, but we see that there's a swift uptake of technology. In fact, mobile money is a much more rapidly growing phenomenon in Africa and is serving to unbank there. So in a sense, Africans seem to be leapfrogging the technology. But in the case of the US, where, again, we are supposedly ahead, let's look at, say, Clay County, Georgia, one of the poorest communities in America. Do you foresee that by 2030, they will cease to exist? In other words, people will have had to move out of these communities just to survive? Or are public administrators like yourself beginning to think through how you might put in place policies right now to ensure that these very poor communities are able to move up the ladder of, you know, living a life of dignity?
So we know that developing countries are able to leapfrog the technology because they don't have to invest the R&D in the development stage. We found this in the mobile communications technology that you spoke about. M-Pesa, M-Cura, that's happening in Nairobi, Kenya, is definitely one of the Kickstarters that we all hold up to be the poster child. But we must not forget the world space AfriSat idea that happened with Noah Samara in the early 1990s, where the grand vision was that everyone was going to have a satellite radio communication, and thereby in which it missed a target and a lot of people couldn't afford it. So we're looking for mobile technology to, the prices of mobile technology to lower so that more people can access the technology. We don't necessarily want to see a increased divide of inequality on the African continent, where some people may have already started down that road, and we're hoping that the playing field will be leveled a lot sooner. In places like Georgia or Clayton, some of the counties that you mentioned where there's high levels of poverty, we know that institutions are closing, especially rural hospitals in Georgia. These hospitals are closing because there's not enough patient volume to sustain the bed rate and the revenue streams that are required. And so a lot of people are basically vacating these rural communities and moving closer and closer to the city where there's better access. One of the things that we do know is that when governments fail, there is an opportunity for entire healthcare systems to be taken over by a central government. Now, this has happened in Europe in a couple of instances where the counties thought that they could administer a health insurance program. They failed miserably, and then the state took it over. So what we're hoping in relationship to the SDG goals is that while they are very well intentioned, we're hoping that the manifestation of those realities do not marginalize people of color even more in the advance of trying to secure food resources, natural resources, energy consumption, and things of that nature that keep the dominant, well-informed people well-fed, right? So, you know,
but could we find, for example, let's take the issue of, again, either the hospital closing. Okay, they don't have enough people to keep a hospital open, but with technology shifting towards personalized medicine, with they're having enough technology for telehealth centers or telehealth treatments, is there not a way to reimagine a semi-rural or a peri-rural community? In your experience in talking to some of the leaders in Black America, the people who are working for Black mayors or working for Black state council people, how are they thinking through these challenges? Is there like an active, let's say, ongoing debate around these sorts of issues?
So what we're finding is that most offices of innovation and technology are top heavy and they're IT centered. And IT centered visioning and innovation is not necessarily the best way to go as far as creating cities of the future. What it's very good at is continuously moving down the road of automation, roboticism, and replacing people out of jobs. What I think what we're hoping within the municipal reign of government and public administrators is that they begin to move away from the urban planning discipline solely as the beacon of future strategy development and creating cities of the future, or moving away solely from just having an IT department being in total control of innovation and technology within public administration and government. And so what I try to do and what I'm hoping that I'm seeing is a better organizing effort to bring in all of the policy disciplines within government, as well as looking at the impact of ICT and e-government on classical public administration organizations.
But couldn't they, isn't there then, if we talk about this idea of government for the people, by the people, and of the people, an organization like the African American Future Society then, couldn't that not be a space in which we begin to organize, let's say, leadership of the different professional organizations in like Blacks in Technology or whomever, and Blacks in Accounting or Black Nurses or the NMA, National Medical Association, in a sort of a almost like let's call it a base camp exercise to dream a small Black city, reimagine them. I mean, is there not a space for that? Do you think that there's an opening of the thinking of the people in power to allow your group to put in place something like that, this sort of social experiment? I mean, we're spending millions of dollars in experimenting in other things. Is there an appetite, you think, for this kind of social experiment?
So I think there is an appetite. I think there's a lack of training in the discipline. I think what happens is many of us have been immersed in classical organizational public administration theory. And I think the advent of technology and ICT forces one to change. I think at the end of the day, the present organizational structure of government is changing. I think the present administration has proven that you do not need as many employees to run government, whether that's good or bad, through the use of technology, which is what people are thinking about. Moving back to the rural question we were talking about earlier about hospitals closing and whether or not telemedicine is good. I think that opportunity will lend itself to more drone-driven medicine, whereby in which if you're using a mobile app and you need a prescription or you need something done, a doctor may be able to hit a button and a drone will fly that medication over to your home. However, that doesn't necessarily negate the need for physical opening of the body and operations and various types of procedures where you might have to go under the knife.
Right.
In relationship to the Black nurses and other types of organizations where we hope that the disciplines in which they're studying will lend themselves to innovation and entrepreneurship, whether it's visioning, and what we're hoping as the African American Future Society, as we move around within the organizations that we work with, that we are broadening the mind in the realities of what's occurring and conducting the environmental scanning of various types of inputs of data and looking at the plausibilities and the what ifs of social action of resources, of people. And we most recently had a meeting with the AFG and a few people at the NAACP in Washington, D.C. And while we were strategizing and talking about the future of Black political action in America, one of the things that I think the panelists did not take into consideration were the numbers of people that will be coming to America, or should I say to the mainland, from Puerto Rico. And those numbers will shift the voting pattern within America long enough for them to change the policy, change the voting habits, and then go back to Puerto Rico with a more favorable outcome. At the end of the day, we're talking about a possible impact of maybe 1.5 to 2 million voters.
Well, as you talk about that, people of Puerto Rico, what popped into my mind is other Black immigrants like myself. I mean, if we think about the future of Black America and the Black agenda, quote unquote, it used to be in the 60s, one had a universal Black agenda per se. Do you foresee a continuing Black agenda in the multicultural Black America that's emerging?
So one of the things is, we look at advertising in America and we look at the impact, the subliminal messages that occur, and we're noticing a disappearance of Black males, not only in advertising, but print media, but we're noticing it even on the streets. And
I'm not seeing that.
Yes, it happens. Well, you're in Washington, D.C., so you're lucky enough to see enough Black men on the street. But if you go through the airports across America, you won't see very many Black people getting on the airplanes. You might see them cleaning the bathrooms or working behind the concession stands, but they're not getting on the planes. One of the things that we noticed in relationship to the diaspora, Caribbean Blacks or African Blacks or South American Blacks, is that we know that we cannot, in a political arena, count all Black people's votes the same, right? I mean, not all Black people either, number one, identify with African Americans in America, and then number two, don't necessarily vote the same voting patterns as African Americans. And so what we see as we work with the US Census is we know that there's a greater stratification of what Blackness is in America. And we know that Caribbean Americans, South American Blacks, Cuban Blacks, African Blacks, and as you know, North African Blacks are still considered white by the Office of Management and Budget, even though they're as Black as your sweater. And so we know that there is a challenge to coalesce and to congregate Black voices and Black visions, but we also know that there is a difference of voices and opinions. And so what we try to do as the African American Future Society is create a space where all of those possibilities, those what ifs, are able to be heard. And then we also hope within the construct, because African Americans are not that many people, right? I mean, you're only talking approximately 40-odd million people. Whereas Africans, there's 600 million. I don't know how many hundreds of millions there are in the Caribbean, but Black Americans really are a small voice. And so
we're very small in the Caribbean as well.
Right. And so what we're hoping is that the African American voice does not get lost in the shuffle. For a long time, African Americans were the beacon of Afro-Caribbean Blackness, of African Blackness, of South African freedom. But as these populations begin to get educated and they take on their own abilities to shape their own futures, they no longer need African Americans to basically help them, right? And so at the end of the day, all the institutions that African Americans had that were viable in the 60s and 70s become less viable in the 21st, 22nd century.
Yeah, and that's not only because of the immigrant voice. You also find that a lot of the young African Americans don't know a thing about them. And then you have the first generation and second generation Caribbean people. So those people who came up to go to school in the 70s, 80s, their children are here, they're having grandchildren, and they need a fish nor fowl. Many of them are just living their lives, not taking part in any struggle, whether it's the quote-unquote traditional Black civil rights struggle or the Caribbean rights against, a colonialism struggle. So that's a whole another conversation in terms of the future of the African, let's say, agenda in terms of global anti-racism movement. But as you think about the status quo and what this new opportunity of Trumpism is providing for us, do you think that the next 10 to 12 years, which actually 2012 years away, do you think that Trumpism is going to force a new agenda to arise from the Black movement, or are we still going to be operating as if it were the 1960s and 70s? What is your take on what you see happening?
So one of the things we know is that African Americans are retiring in greater numbers. However, at present, because African Americans do not control their pension, there will be no Black activism in any large numbers from that particular group that has not secured their pensions for fear of losing their pension. So they're not going to march down the street. They're not, and you see this presently today where there is no Black voice objecting to anything that with the public present administration is doing. You hear nothing. And so silence is death. We heard this during the AIDS movement. It is happening in the Black movement. We possibly will not see Black activism until approximately, as you mentioned, 2030, when enough Black people have secured their pension in enough numbers to be able to march. But right now, the only thing that possibly is out there for us are the Black youth. And right now, not one organization has energized the Black youth in any great numbers to create a movement.
Black Lives Matter. I mean, is Black Lives Matter a movement, or has it now been, or is it now part of the mainstream? Now they have this big funding. Have they become like co-opted into the system in a sense?
So I think Black Lives Matter was a hashtag that took off in a way that the organizers never thought it would. And I think at the end of the day, the original message of the originators possibly got misconstrued or misinterpreted as a result. I think the true meaning and message of Black Lives Matter is a little bit different than what the masses and what the media has thought.
Well, the media has certainly painted them as a terrorist organization. So a lot of Caribbean Blacks are not going to join because they don't want to be, perceived as terrorists. And at the same time, we know that if we continue as we always have, we are going to be facing greater inequality and lack of opportunity. I mean, the whole issue around the future of work, for example, as you said, hospitals are closing. Well, so will schools when we don't have jobs. Or people have to, towns are shipped because jobs are being shipped abroad. Unless, in fact, Trumpism is saying return jobs to these shores and we see a turnaround in terms of some manufacturing return to America. I don't know. Do you think the future of the American dream then in terms of, the Black middle class will continue to grow? Is that viable in today's economy?
So I think there's a report that was put out by the Joint Center of Political and Economic Studies where they were basically tracing the potential automation of job professions. And I think the Office of Labor Statistics, if I'm quoting the gentleman correctly, said that the Office of Labor Statistics tracks about 800 job titles. But at the end of the day, 25% of African Americans find themselves in only 30 of those job titles. And of those 30 job titles, they're all slated to be automated. So when you talk about potential employment in the future, I talk with some good friends over at the Black elected officials in school boards across America. And what we talk about is that there are 8 million Black children in high school, public school in America with no potential future in sight.
But so these are Black elected officials saying this. The question then is, are they saying it in a position of, well, and there's nothing we can do? Or are they saying, this is what we see, therefore, here's what we need to create in order to avert divert or you know, do this before we revert to the days of slavery? I mean, what is being done if they actually are having these conversations?
So one of the things that we're hoping is going to happen is we need to take better control of our education in America, and it should not be a surprise when a Black student graduates from high school, and it should not be a surprise when a Black student goes to college, right? There should be a deliberate intention for these 8 million Black children to have a future. And the deliberate intention of these 8 million children needs to be followed by a national organization like the Black Church, for example, the NAACP, the Urban League, but it should not be a surprise when a Black student graduates from high school and the parents go, oh my God, thank God they didn't go to jail. And so we're hoping.
So in other words, our narrative is the same script from 1930, the same script in 1950, and here we are, almost 100, no, almost 200 years out of slavery in 1838. Okay, so we're about, what, 20 years away from, you know, the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slavery, certainly in the Caribbean region anyway. And we're not seeing, we say, like, this sense that the norms of expectations have been shifted. So as we draw to a close, do you then see that, first of all, before that, so would you say then that we have any hope of entering what people are talking about, a post-racial society, which Obama era was supposed to have brought in? Are we anywhere near there, or are we can still expect to be living in this like double-blind world that we're living in now?
So there's some great movies that are out. One of them is called In Time with Justin Timberlake, which is a really great movie, where society is separated by wealth, power, and privilege. I don't think that's going to change. I think wealth, power, and privilege will continue to separate society. I don't think that we can go through society with blinders on. I think that's still a very much part of everyday living, especially in America. I don't think America is, the United Nations does a study on e-government. I think America measures within the top 15, like 13 or 14. America is not #1 in e-government or ICT.
No.
You know, so
in most things, except for the number of people in prison.
Yeah, I think, for example, believe it or not, I think South Korea actually is #1, and or the Koreans in the Asian society. And I would only hope that in the future, there would be a deliberate intention of making sure that children's futures are secured and not just a mistake.
Well, Jeffrey Sachs actually has taken the SDGs and turned them into America's 2030 goals, and he has 7. And one of his targets are 100% of children have opportunity to early childhood education, 100% of students graduate from high school, and 100% of students have access to tertiary education or skills training. So that is what he's put out there in the chat. But the challenge is that nobody knows what he's doing because he's not plugged into the rest of the community. So do you think that the African-American society, African-American future society, with the connections that you have made, with the role that you personally in your career are playing as a public abolition official, do you think that you can be able to bridge the gap between, let's say, the powers that be that tend to fund these kinds of social experiments and the Black political elite that is still seems to be, you know, representing a 60s mindset? Do you think that you can make this happen?
Well, what we try to do is we try to influence dialogue. I mean, we know that there's approximately 1.1 million Black entrepreneurs, Black businesses out there, but not one of those businesses employ one individual. They're all sole proprietorships. So at the end of the day, what we put on the table is, well, why don't you hire one person? Maybe it could be a small business administration grant of $25,000 to your business, but you hire this person and you train them, as opposed to just looking down on them as an unemployed person who's not trying to be actively looking for work. Because it's very selfish to be a sole proprietor and just earn money for yourself and then look down on everyone else who's broke and poor. And so what we
maybe they just can't afford to bring anybody in, especially with the wages are going up. So as the living wage increases, it's actually not helping small micro business to be able to scale.
Yeah, but yes, but you were asking, how do we kind of see the future in this role as the African Future Society? So what we try to do is we try to whisper into the ears of the power brokers that they need to move down a path. So the path is create an SBA grant for sole proprietorships.
Okay, I didn't hear that part. Okay, I hear that. Okay.
So that's what we do. And on the education side, I think Mr. Sachs has done enough on the planet. I think his role in Russia, if everyone remembers, he's done an interesting thing in Russia, and his work at HIID at Harvard, I think everyone pretty much remembers. So I welcome Mr. Sachs. I think the realization of his work on the planet needs to be understood. And I think at the end of the day, just saying making opportunities available is not a Marshall Plan. Because right now, everyone can go to public school as long as you go, right? That does not mean you're getting a quality education. I think the Japanese had something called, I don't know if it was called the Junkul Academies, whereby which Asian students went to school for specific skill sets. You know, if you was a doctor, you was going to be a doctor from age of 5. If you was going to be an engineer, you was going to be an engineer from the age of 5. If you was going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a lawyer from the age of 5. We need testing of these students all the way through so that they maximize their potential.
I'm hearing 2 experiments there. I'm hearing an experiment around the issue of small business, micro business, startup and expansion scaling, having grants set up to sort of test how that could really help take the unemployed and unemployable and make them employable, and hopefully turn around more funding by actually granting money to small businesses to employ somebody and train them. And I'm hearing this idea of a new type of education model where at least a portion of the black public schools are given the resources, not just to pass people without getting them having any skills, which is the biggest scandal in Washington, D.C. right now, but actually to, as you say, have them from 5 years old begin to be groomed for whatever thing that they think they're going to be, even if they don't end up being that, but at least have them being groomed in a kind of coursework.
Absolutely.
So those are very powerful stories. As you say that then, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about the future that would arise if we're able to do those 2 experiments?
So, I guess I'm a pragmatist, if I understand the definition. I do.
That's probably like, okay, folks, that's close to my neutralistic label. Okay?
But I do want to see an African American future whereby in which African Americans are still part of the picture. I think what's happening because of other voices and other abilities where African Americans have taken the charge, African Americans now are being passed over. And, and passed over because our educational system is so poor. And the educational system around the world is so much better. And so it's if it comes to a choice of hiring, a Black American or a Caribbean or a South American or a Japanese, 9 times out of 10, or even an African, 9 times out of 10, those people are better educated than what we have received in the US-based public school system. So I think that the teachers union in America has held the American system of public education back due to the inability of being well-trained and implementing technology the way it should be. And I think, again, as you mentioned, the developing world can leapfrog American public education by leaps and bounds because they don't have teachers unions to, withhold and hold us back from advancement. So, yes, go ahead.
But I don't want to end on that note, and we're coming to an end. I want you to tell me, if you're neutralistic, what is the headline then from 2030, which is only 12 years away, and you're still going to be a young man, what will the African American Future Society doing that will represent an optimistic or at least a neutralistic world? I mean, we're not talking about dystopia and living behind bars, all of us.
No, I know that's bad.
What's your headline? What's your preferred headline?
My preferred headlines are African Americans have dispersed all across the diaspora to add talent, skills, and abilities and assist in the development of various diaspora countries around the world. That's what I'd like to see.
So, in other words, the future of Black America is global. The future of Black America is Pan-African. And indeed, African Americans will spend less time worrying about making it America and make it elsewhere. That's kind of what I'm hearing. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, in a nutshell, I would go with that definition, yes.
So, folks, you hear it. YUL is talking about the end of the American empire with Black Americans as fodder. Food, fodder for jails, fodder for other negative things. And that might be a very good way to end this conversation for today and to really launch our series on the future history of Black America. Thank you so much, YUL Anderson, President and CEO and founder of the African American Future Society, for spending time with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nelson. I appreciate your time.
And so, folks, that was YUL Anderson. He, as I said, is the president and founder of the African American Future Society. He's a public administrator, and he's currently working on his doctorate in public administration. He does have a master's in future studies. We want to thank you so much for joining us on the Futures Forum Live, where we explore salient ideas to create sustainable futures. Remember, the future is embedded in the landscape of today. So seize your hope, seize your talents, and go out and create the future you want. Thank you so much for staying with us. Until next time, safe journeys.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Futures Forum Live online. This podcast aims to tell and share stories about the emerging future and help us better shape the future we want. The Futures Forum Live online is a production of the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get future sense now. Remember, our future is embedded in the landscape of the present. Share this story and share the future.